Don't call it a comeback. VU Sports Wire has been here for years, rocking our peers and putting suckers at fear. Jackson Martin, after a long hiatus and a season opener that was pushed off by some devious rain right before that opening game against South Carolina, the first episode of VU Sports Wire is finally upon us here as we near the end of September. I am Eric Single, along with Jackson Martin. I'm at a loss for words. It's real good to be back.
It's a big moment for all of us, and a big welcome back to all of you, and also to Eric, who took a semester hiatus with us. But it's time to talk some football.
Finally. I was talking soccer and the other.
It's not the same.
I was watching more Aussie rules football than spring practice football in Sweden, and it's good to be back on the right terms. Anyway, we got plenty to talk about since we've missed so many weeks already. The first episode of the season falls on a bye week, which gives us a good time to kind of take a breath and look back at the first 4 weeks of the season. So that's how we're going to start off the show. And then we'll kind of go a little more in the short-term past and talk about Vanderbilt's recent drubbing at the hands of Georgia and Athens. We're going to talk about the quarterback situation, which is endless
controversy.
For us. We'll discuss the nature of the incident. Or the
it's
situation.
A controversy.
Okay. We'll table that for 5 minutes at least. And then we'll do a little quick look ahead at Vanderbilt's schedule going into the rest of October, and then looking ahead at bowl aspirations. And then we'll take a little step aside and talk about baseball, which is a source of optimism in these dark 1-3 times we are currently experiencing. But let's talk about the 1-3 record. Vanderbilt's start. Coach Franklin has many times referenced the difficulty of Vanderbilt's schedule so far this year. And it's hard to blame him, really, with that season opening loss to South Carolina, followed by a road trip to Chicago to take on Northwestern, then a brief respite against Presbyterian, and then, as I mentioned, that game against Georgia last weekend. Jackson, it's hard to imagine any other team in the SEC willingly taking on that kind of schedule. And Coach Franklin has mentioned multiple times how much out of his control the first month of the season was, and right. I think in the future we'll see a little bit of a more gradual step up in SEC play for the Commodores, but you could clearly see the toll that playing such difficult opponents early on took on this team.
Absolutely. It is never easy when you play 3 of your 4 hardest games in the first month of the season, and that comes with the caveat that the Commodores should have won at least 2 of these games, but South Carolina and Georgia are the 2 best teams on the schedule. No questions asked. And they would probably be the 2 best teams on most people in the SEC schedule, outside of anyone who has to play Alabama and LSU, which just shows you the strength of the SEC East this year. It's not going to be an easy road. It certainly has not been an easy road so far. But this is where we find ourselves at a crossroads with Coach Franklin, and we wonder, what is the process doing? And is this a better team than last year? It's hard to tell based on who we've played. But we're going to learn a lot about this team in the next 3 games.
Exactly. Let's talk about some of the specific positions on the field that were maybe some question marks going into the season. You talk about the offensive line, which both had a lot of experience coming back, but Coach Franklin also emphasized the amount of depth that he wanted and how far the line had left to go. We've definitely seen some weaknesses there, and I think it's reflected on the quarterback play and the play of Zach Stacy, who was kind of perceived to be that workhorse running back.
Right. Well, we did have 2 starting offensive linemen dismissed in the offseason, which would wreak havoc on, quite frankly, any SEC team's line, but particularly Vanderbilt's, which was not a deep line to start out with. And we've been seeing those problems against teams that have just absolutely great front sevens like South Carolina and Georgia. We've seen Jadeveon Clowney and Jarvis Jones just wreak absolute havoc against this line. Jordan Rogers hadn't had time to throw. Zach Stacy hadn't had the holes that he's been looking for to be the dominating presence that he was last year.
Exactly. And then on the other side of the ball, I'd like to talk about the linebackers for a little bit, if that's all right, because I think when you talk about attrition and what the offensive line lost last year, it's hard to imagine how difficult of a proposition it is replacing Chris Marv at the middle linebacker position. But the credit Bob Shoop, defensive coordinator at Vanderbilt, and the entire coaching staff for really kind of ushering in a pretty smooth transition so far. Let's be clear that there have been plenty of issues, especially in those first couple of games. for Chase Garnham, who kind of stepped into that middle linebacking role, but Archibald Barnes, a senior and a vocal leader on the team, and at that other outside linebacker position, we've seen some of that freshman blood come in. Kellen Williams and Darian Herring have done a great job, and you've been able to see the growth. And to transition to the Georgia game, Chase Garnham was one of the few bright spots on the Vanderbilt defense for me. I think he's starting to become a lot more comfortable with his role and his responsibilities. And as a couple of those hits on Saturday, I mean, he was the only guy that you could even conceive of issuing any modicum of pain upon Georgia's freak workhorse tailbacks. And it was an impressive game out of Chase, and I think a good sign of things to come.
Absolutely, and we've seen the growth in Chase Opa Garnham style since game one, where he really struggled with South Carolina's read option plays. Connor Shaw just went off in that game because Garnham, he said in the post-game press conference, he failed to maintain his gap integrity. We saw a slight improvement in the Northwestern game, but he's been getting better every single game. And by the end of this year, he may be the most important player on that defense, particularly if Vanderbilt's going to have a chance against these just as mobile quarterbacks coming up with Missouri's James Franklin and Florida's Jeff Driscoll.
Exactly. Let's go back to last Saturday again and talk about the two tailbacks that really just terrorized Garnham and the rest of the defense in Keith Marshall and Todd Gurley. They were, in my opinion, the story of Saturday's 48-3 loss to Georgia. Just setting the tone early on. Kenny Ladler, I thought, had a superhuman game as far as how many touchdowns he saved by being the last guy to trip him up or push him out or make some sort of contact on those guys, because it was Georgia's first home SEC game, and it was a big statement game for the Bulldogs as far as how legitimate their young influx of talent is on the SEC scale. And although Vanderbilt's defense has taken flack in the past, I think that this defense is good enough that was an impressive performance on all accounts by Georgia.
Absolutely. But something else we saw in that game is just how balanced Georgia's offense is. Whenever the Commodores tried to stack the line to go against either Keith Marshall or Todd Gurley, Aaron Murray just threw the ball deep, and the secondary couldn't compete because they were pushed up. When you play a balanced team like that, it's really hard to figure out a scheme that's going to consistently stop them. And we saw that, quite frankly, all game. Aaron Murray completed his first 11 passes against the secondary that is supposed to be the strength of the Vanderbilt defense. But he was able to do so because Todd Gurley and Keith Marshall are busting runs straight up the middle and gaining just a multitude of yards. There's really not a good way to play defense when you can't take away one thing or the other. Then the thing that you should be able to stop becomes infinitely harder to do so.
I think Confucius first said that.
I think
is that
he did.
correct? We'll have
It
to
was
research
probably
that.
Plato.
Let's stay Western.
We'll look
I
it
guess.
up.
Yeah. In any case, the drubbing at the hands of Georgia also highlighted another big topic of conversation this first month of the season: the quarterback situation, controversy, if you want to call it, Jackson. But Jordan Rodgers back in the starting role after a week off against Presbyterian, where Austin Carter-Samuels led the offense to a 58-point output, but against Presbyterian. You take that with multiple grains of salt, in my opinion. So we step back now in this bye week where Coach Franklin has 2 weeks to decide who will start Vanderbilt's road game against Missouri on October 6th. And you kind of wonder what exactly is going through his mind. The decision to start Austin was the meaning behind it was a little cryptic all throughout the week before and after. And Coach Franklin was a little more candid after the Georgia game, kind of saying that he's gotten to a point where instead of physically putting the starting quarterback on the depth chart and discussing one guy or the other, that he is the starter, this is really going to be an assessment of who practices better. And I think one thing that's different from the Georgia pre-game to the Georgia post-game, I think this has become a situation where the better practice week out of either Jordan Rodgers or Austin Carter-Samuels is going to determine who's the starting job, which is not an enviable position to be in as an offense. I think we've seen good things from both teams, both players, but it's certainly disconcerting. Jordan has yet to lead the offense to more than 13 points this season, and although the Georgia game was Jordan's no, it wasn't Jordan's most complete game. The phrasing of it was interesting to me by James Franklin. He said what he was doing out there made sense to me, and I think that's a pretty ringing endorsement as far as when you try to cut through Coach Franklin's coach speak about the quarterback. So the Rodgers-Carter Samuels debate rages on. Where do you stand right now?
Well, what truly makes me nervous about what's going on with the quarterbacks right now is that based on the poor play of Jordan Rodgers, I think we can definitively say at this point he is no longer firmly entrenched as a starting quarterback. However, this also means that Austin Carter-Samuels hasn't stepped up and taken that job from him, which makes me wonder if we may just be playing the backup quarterback is everyone's favorite player card right now. However, I think that Austin, at any rate, gives us an ability to stretch the field with wide receivers like Jordan Matthews and Chris Boyd that, quite frankly, we don't have with Jordan. Jordan has shown throughout his 1.5 years as a starting well, I guess now it's about a full season in total, he has an inability to accurately and consistently throw the deep ball. Against a team like Georgia, there needed to be an ability to stretch the field. Because there was not with Jordan, Georgia was able to load up the line of scrimmage, stop Zach Stacy for the most part, and say, okay, you can throw the ball 5 yards, we'll give you that. But we couldn't throw the ball downfield. And Austin, while slower with his reads, throws a really good deep ball. And when you have athletes at the wide receiver position like Vanderbilt has right now, you have to take advantage of that. And that is why I think, if not starting the Missouri game, you will see Austin Carter-Samuels starting in one of the next 2 games.
That's a bold prediction. And one thing...
That is a bold prediction. You can count on that.
That's a lock. That's a lead pipe lock.
Lock it. Count it. Go ahead and count
Jackson
it.
Martin. One thing I can't stop talking about that was kind of reinforced from that Georgia game, Jordan's willingness to scramble out of the pocket. It's a matter entirely different from his ability to throw the ball deep downfield. But what we saw last year against Georgia, which was really Jordan's coming out party. So to answer your question, it's been an exact football year since Jordan kind of made his stake for the starting quarterback position at Vanderbilt when he led that
Georgia
comeback.
game was in October last
I'm
year.
talking football years, though.
Football.
The Georgia game to the next Georgia game equals 1 football year in my mind. Can we get a graphic up for like football year related stats?
Football years.
We're
We
putting
can't
up
do that?
all sorts of projects.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Maybe next time.
In any case, what we've seen against South Carolina defense that has terrorized every quarterback, and against Georgia's defensive front was Jordan Rodgers. When you know that is his main weapon, defenses become fast enough to track him down and keep him from picking up 20, 30 yards at a time.
And it's no longer a weapon.
Right. So I'm gonna try to unpack this with you a little bit.
Okay.
You think over the next 2 games, because the next thing I want to talk about is where this season goes from here. You look at this 1-3 start. Coach Franklin is making the completely respectable excuse that this is one of the hardest schedules that an SEC team could be asked to play in its first month of the season, especially with a second-year head coach. Although it's hard to make excuses at this point about the organization of the program. I think Coach Franklin has that part down. I don't think anybody's got an issue with that. But still, it's important to realize it's been less than 2 calendar years, not football years, two calendar years since Coach Franklin has come to Nashville.
I think it's less than 2 football years too.
Is that right? I think so. All right, we need a strict definition from here on out.
We'll get back to you on that.
In any case, you look at that opening stretch, and now when you break down how the rest of the season works out, you have a throwaway game against UMass, but these upcoming 3 games that define October, I think is really going to be. I mean, it's the gateway to a bowl berth for sure,
right,
because November contains some winnable games against Kentucky and Ole Miss, but it's also an opportunity to make
3-1 Ole Miss Rebels. Let's be clear.
It's also an opportunity to take a little bit of inventory about Vanderbilt's progress relative to the SEC, because a Florida team waits on October 13th. That seems to have,
which is the only ranked opponent left on Vanderbilt's schedule.
Right, and we've seen a lot of strong performances out of that Florida team so far. At least some competitiveness that we maybe didn't see last year. And then Auburn on October 20th. One of the big disappointments of the SEC season to date. But it all starts against Missouri on October 6th, a road game which I'm personally very nervous about, being as James Franklin is still looking for his first SEC road victory.
I think that this Missouri game has become the most important game left on the schedule. In terms of whether or not these Commodores get a bowl bid, Missouri has shown itself through the first weeks of the season to be an eminently beatable team, especially if James Franklin isn't completely healthy. And our James Franklin needs to take advantage of that if we're going to continue this rhetoric about not just being a 5-7, 6-6 team every year, but actually competing in the SEC.
Let's talk. So, what in your eyes is the primary goal that you can expect for the rest of the season? Is bowl berth the mountaintop at this point, or bowl victory, or somewhere higher?
I would not be comfortable doing that because I think a bowl berth was the expectation going into this season, and despite these early losses, I don't think there's any reason to recalibrate that expectation because a bowl berth is still eminently achievable. In fact, I still think it's probable. That may just be the ridiculous optimist in me, but this is a Vanderbilt team that can win every game from here on out, maybe Florida accepted. I haven't quite
It is at home.
I haven't quite bought into the Gators
On Parents
yet.
Weekend. It's at home on Parents Weekend.
Parents,
so
you can
know
go
the
ahead
crowd
and
will
chalk
be
that one
popping
up
off.
for us. We got this one in the bag. But we're going to learn a lot about this team in these next 3 games because these are 3 winnable games, but also probably the toughest winnable games that we have left. It's not inconceivable that we start this season 1-6.
Right.
But then after that, it's not inconceivable that we win our next 5 games and still go to a bowl game.
Let me make the counter argument to your previous statement. I think in some situations, the toughness of this October has always been there, but the way Vanderbilt lost 3 of its first 4 games has kind of opened a second possibility for the second season. Because let me propose this. I know it's not necessarily the way that James Franklin likes to operate, but it's a general college football truism when we talk about rivalries and year-to-year matchups and things like that I think might be more relevant this year than in other years. I think if Vanderbilt wins less than 2 of its October games, UMass included. I am totally, as a fan, I am totally at peace with the idea of making this entire season a run-up to making things right against Tennessee from last year. I think it's entirely possible for James Franklin to not take this team to a bowl game, yet beat Tennessee and keep the morale at a steady rate from last year. Because I think that particular game has more weight than it has enough weight to carry the momentum of an entire season of basically having the rest of the SEC figure out James Franklin and what this new Vanderbilt team is trying to do.
Right. And now I think we saw at the end of last year the narrative of James Franklin's program was not just that we were successful, but that our program was on the rise and Tennessee's was on the decline, which I think leads into this exactly what you're saying, that even if we don't make a bowl, or if we just go 6-6 and qualify for a bowl, beating Tennessee validates this entire season. It is something that this school has had a complete inability to do basically throughout its football history. And like you said, it's our only real rivalry. That is the team that we should be striving to beat every year. And like other SEC rivalries, if we go 1-11 and beat Tennessee, I'm happy.
Yeah.
To be perfectly honest, I'm happy.
And given all the post-game theatrics after last year's victory, I think the game has ramped itself up even beyond the little brother aspect that Vanderbilt fans constantly attributed to it. So Tennessee has showed enough positive flashes early on in the season, despite a relatively weak schedule, that I think it's going to, like as you mentioned, look good enough to carry the momentum past whatever bowl requirement happens or doesn't happen. Let's switch sports for a second before we wrap this first show of the year up and talk a little baseball. The Vanderbilt Commodores,
Go Braves.
The Vanderbilt Commodores are back on the diamond for the first time officially.
On the turf diamond.
Of the turf diamond. Let's start there actually.
Let's start there.
First week of practice official week of practice for Vanderbilt this week, And Coach Corbin was out on Wednesday afternoon speaking with Jackson and some others about the new field. Vanderbilt is now a completely turf baseball field with the exception of the pitcher's mound, which is still dirt.
Is it from what I saw, it was turf.
That wasn't a cover?
I could, you can't really tell. They didn't
They,
really
they
tell
held
us,
they
but
held
it
the held the frat league intramural softball finals on Hawkins Field last night, it was covered up in
when
turf.
we were there for practice. It was turf.
Okay, yeah. So Vanderbilt becomes the only other stadium in the country besides Wichita State to have an entirely turf field. Coach Corbin mentioned on Wednesday that it was because of the weather challenges that Vanderbilt faces playing in Nashville and trying to practice during December, January, February, which is completely understandable. But what kind of a sense did you get from him and from Connor Harrell and the other players about how it's playing so far and just their general impressions of it?
Well, especially with Connor Harrell, you got the sense that he was really impressed that they have managed to tune the field to basically play like a true grass and dirt playing surface. They've been adjusting the field throughout the practices this year, and Connor Harrell says that it reacts exactly like Hawkins Field did before, sliding accepted where if you slide in the second, you got to start your slide a little earlier. But the ball is playing the same way, or at least that's the initial reaction from the players. When there's a little bit more activity on there, it gets hardened down a little bit. We'll see what their reaction is then. But as for now, the players and Coach Corbin, who's a big baseball traditionalist, seem to be really happy with the new turf.
That oversliding issue was flared up last night during the frat league finals. In case you were interested,
which I am.
Yeah. How were Coach Corbin and the players feeling about the team as a whole beyond the field with the number one recruiting class in the nation,
Right.
back in the can ready for next year, but a bunch of promising freshman prospects coming in this year and
Right.
a lot of things to be excited about with Mike Yastrzemski, Connor Harrell coming back, and Conrad Greger leading this team on offense and the pitching that we've seen some
Right.
depth in towards the end of this past season.
Well, Coach Corbin never likes to get ahead of himself, but he did mention that this season has a little bit of the same feel as 2011 when the Commodores went to Omaha. He said that this is a team that, because it was so young last year, we know about that just huge struggle that they had at the beginning of the year, then turned it around to really become one of the 10 best teams in the country by the end of it. But he says that this season has that same kind of feel as 2011 and that really he's excited for this team. He expects them to compete, and I get the sense that his expectation is Omaha or nothing.
What do you think? Me being in Sweden, I only caught the tail end of the games from the 2012 season, but it certainly looked like it reminded me a lot of Georgia's run 2 years ago to the NCAA tournament. It was 3 years.
Three years
in a similar fashion, playing an extremely difficult schedule to start off the year, and then kind of working back in and finding their rhythm during the SEC schedule, and then kind of turning on late.
I mean, really, the key piece that we lose is Anthony Gomez, who, as Corbin mentioned, was the guy who made that team go. But Corbin also expects a couple of freshmen to play, if not start. And he's excited for the new guys, too, as much as we see Coach Corbin get excited. And him and Connor Harrell both, just nothing but good things to say about the team, about the schedule, about how it sort of lets them ease in, but they're playing 2 more games than they did last year. They're going to take advantage of the full 56-game schedule, which means no fall series this year. But this is a team that I think is shaping up for an SEC and an NCAA tournament run.
We'll certainly keep an eye on baseball's fall practice, and of course, get you ready for the Mizzou game in a little more detail next Thursday at 5 o'clock, which is the official regular standard time.
That's what we're doing.
Starting time for VU Sports Wired. But for now, it's great to be back. It's great to see you all again. For Jackson Martin, I'm Eric Single. Have a great weekend, devoid of Vanderbilt football, and go Doors.